All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Wasm Cloud Wednesday for Wednesday, March 19th. We've got a couple, we got a demo, a couple discussion items for today. Should be a good time. Before I get into the agenda, though, we actually have Luke Ark here, who has been in the Wasm Cloud community for quite a long time. But I think this is your first Wasm Cloud community meeting appearance. Luke, did you want to do like a quick intro about yourself and how you found Wasm Cloud and anything else that you feel like sharing?
Yeah, sure. So I've probably been in Wasm Cloud about a year and a half, coming on to 2 years now, pretty close. Um, I actually came into Wasm Cloud before I even knew about Nats, which Wasm Cloud is based off of. And I've kind of been going in from the top down rather than the bottom up than most people. But um, but yeah, I got into Wasm components probably before I heavily got into Wasm modules. And then yeah, I've never looked back. I can't program normally again, so I absolutely love it.
Yeah, I love it. And Luke, I know that you proposed, thank you for doing intro, by the way. And proposed a discussion item for later in the community meeting. I did just sh I did just shift it down to below the demo. But I'm super excited to talk about it.
Let's go.
All right. Um, Great. Well, for today's agenda, we got a quick demo about WebAssembly composition, which should be a fun one. Then we'll do a discussion on, again, one of the things that Luke is proposing, kind of put up in a PR. I think it's a really interesting proposal, the virtual components initiative. Um, well, I wanted to talk something more administrivia, but in our organization around the Stalebot that we have kind of trawling around. And then Taylor also had an update from the wasi-config, which is like the upstream interface that we use for component and provider and link configuration. There's some updates happening there, and I think he's soliciting a little bit of feedback. So why don't we go ahead and get started? So I wanted to begin with a little bit of backstory and talk just briefly about WebAssembly components. So when launching Wasm Cloud 1.0 last year, about a year ago, it was in April, the main mission, the way that we wanted the component experience to feel in Wasm Cloud is that you were composing components over the lattice. So over this distributed RPC, we're using Nats for it, but just a distributed RPC layer. But from the user component experience or from the actual code that you write, not to bring in all of the complexities of RPC, but we wanted it to feel and be compatible with just composing components together. So the whole story, stop. No. Sorry, my mouse is broken, so it keeps bringing up this window. Okay, this is horrible. No, I'm just not going to move it. The whole story about WebAssembly components and composing them together is a core part of the WebAssembly component model. It's kind of like it's kind of just like traditional CFFI, but really it is linking together. We were use the word linking over NATs, but it is composing one component's import with another component's export so that when one component calls the function, that ends up invoking a function that was in a different component. And this is core to the way that we, internally, Wasmtime actually does call this linking. But this is core to the way that different composable pieces of compute, these WebAssembly components, can talk to each other. So we essentially extended this all the way through our Wasm Cloud to fit our Wasm Cloud model, where you have multiple distributed pieces of compute, whether it's a component or a capability provider. They can communicate over a single interface, like a single function, and you link them together to allow them to invoke each other on an RPC layer. Now, this is a way that you can do runtime composition with Wasm Cloud. If you're interested in learning a little bit more of the difference in our documentation under platform overview, we have linking at runtime, which details, the way that we do linking, the way that two different components can communicate with each other. But we also have this notion of linking at build time. Now, this is outside of Wasm Cloud entirely. This is core to the component model where you can link two components together on a function or on a set of functions and compose them into a single WebAssembly component. Where like they don't share memory, they don't share the global table, but they're able to communicate over a certain interface. Now, the tooling to actually make this happen or to be able to do this is called WebAssembly compositions or WAC. Very fun. You can whack components together and it forms, a composed component that preserves all the details of all of the two original WebAssembly modules that were inside of that component. So a simple example of this is exporting a function name, and then another component imports a function name, and then you can compose those together so that they, become one component. Now, WAC is a CLI. So if we take a look here, we can take a look at the CLI. WAC is a tool for creating this. There is also the WAC language where you can essentially specify your component graph. But traditionally, this is probably a little more than we want individual developers to have to worry about to compose for the first time. So there is a really nice utility in WAC called WAC plug. And WAC plug essentially takes the exports of any number of components that are in a plug shape and allows you to plug it into the socket of a different component where they have an import. So I'm actually going to give you a little bit of a preview of something that we're working on for a KubeCon booth demo, but hopefully it illustrates the point pretty well in how you do this composition. So I have a single WIT interface. Let me open the actual WIT interface. I have a single WIT interface so that I can implement a component that validates a transaction. Very, very simple. Here is your transaction. Do you return a bool? Should this be valid? True or false? And from the perspective of the component that implements this interface, it's very, very simple. I get to write such a small amount of business logic here to, in this case, this component does something really dumb. It just says, hey, if the currency is the US dollar, then sure, we'll let it go through. Otherwise, I don't know how to handle that. Totally made up rule, but from the perspective of like a really small component, this is super nice. And if you build this, I don't even need to do this. If you build this component and then inspect it, so take a look at the WIT interfaces, you have, some of the things that come in from just adapting the component, WASI logging, and then we are exporting our single validation function. Now, if you have been working with Wasm Cloud for a while or working with WebAssembly, you know that in order to call this function, you essentially need to trigger the component. And that is usually done either by using like a messaging interface or HTTP, but generally like you can't just like call this function out of nowhere. So I've actually created a different component where instead of exporting this validation function, I am importing that validation function. So I'm pulling that in as an external dependency, a component dependency, and then I'll export the messaging handler. So the whole purpose of this component is to receive an incoming message. This can be over NATs. It can be like slurped in from a Kafka event stream. But this deals with the deserialization of like a payload. And then we call this validate function, which we have essentially generated. So this is basically a wrapper around like the business logic to plug in the transport layer. Now, if I take a look at, I've built this before, I can distribute this component. If I inspect this component, and inspecting this lists every single function that it could try and call or make use of or export at runtime. You can see that my one export is the messaging handler, but my import up here is the WasmPay platform validation function. And you notice that's the same export that I have in my other component. So when you compose these together, you essentially take this import and export pair, you link them together so that when the one component calls the function, it's actually invoking the code in the other component, core to the WebAssembly component model. So you have a couple of options here. You can, hopefully I have this in my history. You can use whack plug to essentially plug the messaging component together with my built component and then output the composed WebAssembly. And if I inspect this, you can actually see that that one import export pair has actually been collapsed into a function call that's internal to the component. There is no longer a validate function that has been imported. There's no longer one that's been exported because now that dependency is not a function that you expect to get from the runtime when you actually run it. So this is super cool. You can compose these components together. If I run this component, I can invoke it over NATs. I'll focus on the business, or sorry, the composition piece, so I can run this in a second. But cool. Now, when it comes to doing this repeatedly, I mean, this is something that, every single time you build your component, you need to recompose these. You need to recompose it to create your final component. You can actually break them apart, but we won't get into that. There are a couple of things that you may need to do. So, what I have been doing for a while is I have a component where I change the build script to be like this shell file. I run a cargo build, and then I compose these together with whack. But this also means that you need to have this tool installed locally and work with it, know how it works. So what I have added into Wash, which is in a PR, so still needs to make it in. What I've added into Wash is the ability inside your wasmcloud.toml, you can specify some parameters for composing components when you run Wash build. So after we've built your component, we can actually take a socket and compose this together with that component. And the final output is your composed WebAssembly component. And the way that this, I have some notes on naming and things, but we'll come back here to talk about it. The way that this actually works is I'm going to run a Wash build. This is just like with my local copy of Wash. This runs the build. And then after building the component, it will compose it together into a final, it will compose it with that other component. And if we inspect it, we can see that this has essentially been composed together on that single function. So you can actually use, instead of the CLI, there is a programmatic API for the WebAssembly composition tooling that we can take advantage of in Wash. It's just a Rust library, so you don't need that tool installed at all. And essentially, the way that it works is we pull in both components, we register them in this composition graph. You can imagine the graph set up for all these imports and exports. And then we call, wait, where'd it go? And then we call the plug function. Yep, from the library. So we're basically doing the same thing as the CLI, but we can do it programmatically and just after you run wash build. So I think that this is going to make the composition story a whole lot simpler, especially in some of our examples where we compose components together. It's gonna be super nice to be able to just run, super nice to just run wash build and get your final composed binary, or sorry, final composed component. And the benefit of this too is that we actually preserve the original built component and the composed component. So if you wanted to work with either or push both of them up to your registry, then you can do that as well. Now, Jonas brings up a great point. Now we have options with the Wasm Cloud introduces already many different terms into the ecosystem. When you come in and you're like, I'm going to program some WebAssembly stuff, you have to learn about components, you have to learn about interfaces, you have to, in Wasm Cloud, we have this notion of capabilities, always trying to keep that simpler. And it struck me when writing this out, though it is descriptive to the original tool, that this kind of makes you know makes it so that you have to know about the plug-in socket terminology, which I don't think that the plug-in socket terminology is bad. It's just not used anywhere in our code. So this functionality is not very hard to implement because there's already the WebAssembly component library. But what I would like to do is consider a couple of things, like in the wasmcloud.toml, maybe the composition, the compose section should just be under the component config. This is something that I think we can do. Um, Maybe socket instead of being socket could be something like exporter or importer. I'm interested in ideas here because I wasn't able to I looked at this for a little bit yesterday. Something didn't immediately come to mind, but I want to tie this. Maybe it's just, components, and we essentially can do the work when we are parsing. Where to go? I think ideally, if we just pointed at a bunch of components to compose with, maybe we could parse the package, take a look at the imports and exports, and figure out how these should be composed together. We definitely have options here, and this was one of the reasons why I wanted to bring it up in the community call, not just to show cool WASM composition, but to talk about this naming a little bit. Jonas, you had a couple thoughts around like, you know, sockets and the terminology here. You like the components thought, like just, trying to keep it simple.
Yeah, I think that as it stands, like there's so much language to learn, like you said. I feel like as much as we can lean into existing language that we already have in the ecosystem to kind of like ubiquitous language in ubiquitous language terms, like just reuse the existing language instead of inventing new things, even if the underlying tools might have slightly different terms for this. Like plugs and sockets make no sense to anybody, but components and composition does, right? So I would lean into like those terms instead of the tool specific things because I think it's just confusing and it doesn't add anything. In fact, I think it just creates more terms you have to care about for no real gain. So that would be my vote is just trying to lean into the existing language.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it makes sense. The I mean, I think ideally, well, I mean, obviously there's got to be a list. Ideally, it would be great to be able to just specify a bunch of components and then we kind of figure that out for you the way you should be composing them. I think that m- that could be ambiguous, but for the 90% case, maybe this would work just fine. Um, Masood, yeah, you had a good question. Isn't this essentially a client server or service provider consumer relationship? Yeah. I mean, one of the components has the function exported for you to call, and the other component has the function imported to call it. So, that there is a directionality to this, and the relationship is um it's the same as links where we have a source and a target like RPC. Um, you know, whatever is the best description for that relationship is, I feel like, notoriously hard. Um, but essentially, yes, it is like it is kind of like a client server style relationship, like offering a function to call versus calling it. Colin, I saw you come off
Oh, yeah.
muted. Didn't know if you had
Sorry. I am, for
thoughts.
some reason, this is, oh, I know why, but everyone's coming off lunch and I'm getting, um, yeah, I mean, I think whack is fairly straightforward in how it composes things. And I think the closer we stick with whack, I know one's a command and this is a config, but one could see a config for whack. And if there is such a config for whack, it should look as much like this as possible. So that's my only view.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree. Like once you get the directionality right, doing whack plug is super simple. And works really well. So I
Yeah,
definitely want to preserve that
I,
experience.
it's one of the more intuitive things I've done with all of the WebAssembly stuff. Sometimes it's a little hard to. I mean, I think wit import, export, use is hard because I don't think there's anything else that for which use and import are not synonymous, right?
Mhm.
And I think that's a little bit of a head fake for people. But once you understand that part, whack and any component stuff kind of makes a lot more sense. So
Mhm.
that's it.
Yeah. Let's see. I think the only other option that we have, which we don't have to talk about now because we're already halfway through the meeting, we have other discussions. But we always have the option to essentially use whack inside of wash and like offer a wash compose, wash plug, whatever we wanted to call it, utility. It's just often this is happening at the end of a build anyways. So I think we could evaluate, which what we wanted to do there. But um, yeah, like I mentioned, we're already about halfway through the community call. So if folks have other things they wanted to bring up for this, please feel free to raise your hand. But what I'm taking away is that when revisiting this PR, just trying to take more of the burden on terminology on the um, Wasm Cloud side, if possible, and then for the developer experience, should be super simple to specify what components you want to compose with. The less terms, the better. Um, I'm gonna drop the PR in the comments in the chat. Folks, feel free to leave comments on that issue for thoughts. The CI is failing, but don't worry about it. Just a draft PR. It's fine. It's fine. All right. Well, thank you all for let me talk about that for a little bit. Looking forward to kind of pushing this forward a little bit, doing more fun WebAssembly compose things. Okay. So moving on to the next part of the demo, I'll just share really quick, or demo, the community meeting, I'll just share really quick to show it. We did want to talk about the virtual components initiative. So this is a PR, like I mentioned, that Luke Ark actually opened. If my browser will load, great. And it has a lot of um, maybe thought leadership is the wrong word, but Luke is certainly a massive power user of Wasm Cloud and is constantly kind of pushing the boundary of what we support. So one, thank you, Luke. It's really awesome for us as a project to have a use case like yours. It also, you are totally willing to dive deep in the technology and then implement things that are missing, which is huge. So actually, before I steal all your thunder, Luke, did you want to give an overview of the of this issue of this PR and like what you're enabling with it?
Yeah, sure. Damn, I wish I had some like notes or like some photos I can show to actually like give what I'm viewing across, but I'll do the best with words. So let me just take 1 minute just to kind of like break down how I view Wasm Cloud as a runtime, and then I think that give some important context. So when I think about a lattice is made of two layers, a inner layer and an outer layer. The reason why I separate it into two layers is because the inner layer is a bunch of very, very tightly coupled components that are coupled by interfaces, and they can route RPC messages and these data packets between each other. On the outside of that, you have providers, which actually connect this internal lattice to the outside world and allow messages to get in and out. So the reason why I want to create that separation, that segregation, is that we can boil that down to say all messages that ever come into the internal lattice will be provided through providers. And with the edge case of something like wash call, but underneath that would just be using NATS as the communication layer anyway. So NATS is almost like that bedrock provider anyway for the runtime. So at the moment, when you have all these connections, let's just imagine a WADM file, a WADM manifest. Once you define this manifest, you basically create a declaration of the entire system that you want to deploy and manage. And it's all good to go. The runtime will take care of loading everything up, taking care of, connecting everything. And so this is one of the really cool emergent properties of interface-driven development. The fact that instead of choosing how to connect your components because of business logic, instead, the actual runtime does this as well. It uses interfaces as the first party driving force for how to connect these components together. So if I just load in component A and component B and component C, and component A, has a piece of business logic that needs to talk to, let's say, a hello world interface. Once it talks along that hello world interface, given that the link is already constructed, the runtime would basically be able to know where to send that invocation because of the interface and not because of the component. And so once we start getting a bit more complicated, and let's say component A needs to connect to component B and C, and then both of those components exhibit the same interface, that's where it gets a bit more tricky, because now we don't really know where to send this RPC. So that's one of the main reasons why Wasm Cloud use links. Links actually give that context awareness to be able to have the runtime decide, oh, okay, do I need to send it to there or there? So so recently I came across a need that I have an external service that I need to be able to control, communicate, and interact with from my internal lattice, which are a set of components. And in order to do that, I had to set up a wRPC server. And so just for absolute completeness, wRPC is that transport layer, which actually is the glue and binds all of these things to be able to connect to each other along NATS. NATS is the transport. So I came across a couple of issues. Firstly, I thought that I'd just be able to put in the component ID, and then I'll be able to abstract it as a component. And then, then there were some other errors, such as, I need to add potentially a header. And then, as I said before, I came into Wasm Cloud from the top down rather than the bottom up. So my driving force is that I need to be able to control and do all of my business logic on the component layer, just to create that clean bed of computation on top of NATS, which can control the infrastructure as it needs to be controlled. So in order to do that, components at the minute do not have any way to communicate with that underlying infrastructure. So anything that's external to the lattice, just like we brought up in the pull request, components currently cannot control. And so the approach that I took to this was to be, what is the least amount of work I can do to get something feasible? And so I took the inspiration of the existing set link name function that exists in the bus protocol, and it basically does the same kind of thing. Instead, we now have the set component name. I think I called it. Might be slightly different. Yeah, set target component. So just to create a good distinction here, when we talk about the internal lattice uses link names to decide where to route invocations. However, in this current prototype, I use components to decide where to route invocations. And the reason why I do that is because now these services and resources that we're talking to are external to the lattice. And so you can almost think of it like oil and water, where you have this very crystalline structure that is totally coupled together of these components. But when you start talking to external services, that same coupling cannot be applied because those external services do not obey the same link name rules as you would in an internal lattice. And so this is where that separation happens. Once we start talking to external components, we actually have to switch our perspective and say, oh, okay, instead of calling these based on internal link names, we have to call them by components. And just to conclude all of that, the reason why we have to do that is because the Wasm Cloud runtime itself is not aware of the external services. It's almost like if you're calling an API or a weather API, you don't know anything about them. They just have to give you to say, how can you communicate with them? And so this is along the same lines where it's like, this pull request is meant to give the ability to route and invocate other services external to the lattice that the Wasm Cloud has no recollection or knowledge of from the get-go. And so that's what this pull request achieves. In terms of the initiative, the reason why I want to talk about this initiative is this isn't the only way to do it. So at the moment, this is the least kind of cost, but as you've said in the pull request as well, it introduces some other issues and some other things that we need to talk about, such as security, because now components can actually decide where to route information. Do we then start delegating these permissions to NATS credentials, or is there another way to do it? We can potentially create middlewares that are gateways to basically whitelist these services that Wasm Cloud can talk to. And so, it's basically a three-dimensional. What I'll try and boil it down to is just like the picture that I put in the PR is a three-dimensional problem where everyone has to decide how much work do we want the user to do in order to make an external service compatible with Wasm Cloud. What are the underlying requirements for that compatibility to take place, such as needing to use wRPC? And how much validation and verification do we need in that communication? Because, for example, if I just put in a component ID, I can fire it anywhere on this subject-based partitioning layer, and it's absolutely fine. But then the developer doesn't have any feedback, such as, oh, this doesn't exist, or, oh, you're not allowed to access this. And so, to conclude all that, I just kind of want a balanced way that we can control declaratively what external components can we talk to, and then what implications, if any, would that include by supporting that.
Yeah, Luke, thank you so much for going through like your thinking and how you got to this. It's super helpful.
Can you keep the share up?
Oh yeah, sure. Here, let me go back to the original, and I can ping this too so that folks can see this.
Yeah.
I just usually stop the share so that we can see everybody's beautiful face.
No, well. Yeah.
Uh, so, yeah. So Luke, this spurred a lot of thoughts in my head since, here, actually I really like your kind of two-tiered lattice explanation. You are totally willing to to have an external service implement wRPC. And essentially, you just want to be able to hook into the RPC layer that we set up at a platform layer, and that is available on all of the hosts to invoke something that a host may not be, or that a host isn't managing, right? And that's totally possible with NATs and with different transports. Sorry, I saw you came off me. I didn't mean to talk over you.
No, no, no. I was just giving confirmation, absolutely. And just to be very specific about that, I want to be able to do that on the component layer rather than the infrastructure layer. Just to um, my I guess one of my priors is that um, this would become more successful and feasible the closer we get to full uh, control, interaction, business logic that is completely encapsulated in this component layer rather than the underlying hacks in quotation marks that we have to do to talk to external and existing systems.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I've always seen Wasm Cloud as the answer to the issues that at a kind of an enterprise level. Oh, sorry. Look at Masood raises his hand and sorry, Masood. And how do you control what people are doing and at the same time say what people can do, right? I think it's a very different if you're coming at it from that perspective. That's how I've always come at Wasm Cloud. So I don't know. That's the way I'm. It's a way to very finely control things, because you kind of have the platform provider and you have the users, and that's kind of the thing that Kubernetes has always been unable to do, right? It's a differentiator against Kubernetes, and components versus Docker, same thing. So that's always been the tension, and that's been the tension between really WASI and other WebAssembly runtimes for the for server-side WebAssembly. Is the sandbox versus we want the sandbox, we don't want the sandbox. We want the control over people, we want people to do what they want. So that's always been the tension. But yeah, I think also the kind of the other wrinkle to this is we always bring up that, well, providers are eventually going to be WebAssembly as well. So if providers are eventually going to be WebAssembly as well, then we kind of need to solve something like this anyway, right? So it definitely is a problem. I haven't read enough of this PR to have an opinion, but yeah, it's what you're describing is definitely an issue and something that's going to have to be solved.
Yeah, Masood, go ahead.
At some level, I think this needs to really be like the other one on the issue, and we put our thoughts out. But something that immediately came to my mind when Luke posted this, and I read the message, was that in some sense, again, this kind of uh, a way, and I'm not saying that this is the way, but a way that we expect in the future the platform to integrate with providers that now natively support WPRC, wRPC. Because if you remember, in some sense, our providers are a way of bridging the gap between the platform and the legacy environment, such as, let's say, Redis, which doesn't understand, let's say, wRPC or interfaces and so on, right? So in some sense, we can say that if in the future the platform, I mean, WebAssembly and WASI and component model becomes more and more popular, then some service providers start natively supporting these protocols, and then you say that, why do I need a provider here? And if I can do that, let's say, for example, authenticate it through workload identity and those to establish some sort of trust, and it already natively supports RPC, being it provider, being it component or whatever, then I let it over my lattice with proper authorization to communicate, right? And then you name it whatever you want, virtual component or something. And again, I'm not saying not necessarily this is the solution, but it's a way that in the future we should expect when other services start supporting these protocols, and they would ask the question of how do I plug into your platform?
Yeah, just to go off on that. I'll completely agree. And let's just take the case of, Redis at some point natively integrating a feature to allow us to communicate with them. Then we don't need the Redis provider anymore to be that gateway between the Wasm cloud and the legacy system.
Yeah, but you still need to oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Sorry.
No. I was just going to finish off and say, but the thing to remember about that is that means that Redis needs to integrate that.
You still need something somewhere saying this component can talk to Redis and this component can't.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
As long as that's solved, then
Yeah, for sure. I think we definitely we do have a policy service in Wasm Cloud. So we always have that's invoked every time a component calls a specific interface for the first time or what have you. So you can write policies around denying that stuff. We'd want to, draw that up to show how and all of that. Well, what this really makes me start thinking about in general, well, existential question, everything is that this is, I guess there's two parts to this. There's the acknowledgement that there are, services that interact with the outside world that know how to speak wRPC, which is a pattern that so many of our providers follow. Well, I guess all of them in some way follow now. Like the Redis provider, for example, understands wRPC over the NAS transport and uses that information to, open up a socket, a connection to a Redis database. Or messaging, right? It's all kind of a translation. So this virtual component idea really strikes me as similar to providers, and it makes me wonder if we could integrate this somewhat into our provider model, because it's I might be going off on a tangent. So I'll
like
pause there.
dynamic provider declaration or something like that.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Something like that. Yeah, like right now, providers don't really do that much that's special to be managed by a Wasm Cloud host. Like we tell the host to download the binary and start it and pass it this nicely formatted, base 64 encoded string with all the information the provider needs to connect to NATs. But if you just ran a binary that connected to NATs and could speak wRPC and joined the lattice or whatever, then that would work the same. So,
Yeah, you needed to persist. I mean, the biggest thing is you need to persist sockets, right? And connections.
Brooks, I agree with what you said, because that also kind of reminds me of the role that providers are playing. The only difference here is that right now we develop providers. What it says is that now, as you said about that, any binary connecting to NAT, someone else is that, let's say, if the NATS upstream project that decides that they want to natively and graciously support, let's say, the messaging interface of WASI, and then we just become consumers of the interface rather than now we're writing something that can bridge that, the NATS API to our with interface and APIs that we have, right? So they're the same. It's just that now who's developing and maintaining it in a sense, right?
Yeah.
And that's where it participates in the lattice, because in our case, we download it and we run it. In that case, it says something magically appears on the lattice and says, I want to talk to you.
Yeah. I viewed workload identity as a potential enabler for doing this securely, like for
Oh,
joining.
absolutely.
Yeah, joining the lattice, knowing that you should be able to do that. Anyways,
And what Colin says is completely valid, that
yeah,
we should not forget that sandbox aspect of.
that is the other part of this issue that I'm curious what other folks have. This is the only thing, and Luke, apologies for kind of giving you like the one comment review on the PR, but it was just, since you threw it on the community meeting agenda, I figured we talk about it. And this was one of the things that stood out as the most important change that happens here, which is inside of the component, like user provided code is where you are deciding where you're routing your invocation to. And, kind of as currently implemented, you are not just deciding and providing that information, you are allowing that invocation to, right?
Yeah, definitely. I did address some of this stuff, just some very basic ideas in the reply to you. And just to go on that, it's for example, at the minute, like users already have to manage their permissions for NATs and what invocations can boot where. So it's almost like if they then decide to use this functionality, they should decide to use it with the idea in mind that they also have to make sure that they're not opening up security holes.
Well, it's
and then
different. It's
and then
different
there's
users.
another approach you can take where you could actually delegate these JWTs to the components themselves, and basically have each component have their own permission set based on how we need to delegate and provide that to them. But yeah, it's definitely not a one size fits all thing.
Yeah, you definitely see a service that needs to dynamically change something, right? Based on maybe, I mean, there we have, there are services that like webhook services, right, or something like that, where it's like, oh, I have to actually call out to this guy now, and I need to, based on this request, do something to alter my behavior, and if it has that scope, if I have that in scope, could dynamically change the provider, right, or something like that. Maybe provisioning Redis tables or something like something. I don't know, but yeah, that's definitely a thing that we're gonna have to get to. It's no matter what, these problems all have to be solved as Wasm Cloud evolves.
I mean, the interesting thing, we can actually still dynamically configure this with the use of, and I'm not just trying to segue, but it works out great, with the use of WASI runtime config. Like you can configure it, this target component, which here is set to mock server. And thank you, Luke, again for the example. We could actually fetch the target from a piece of configuration which you provide to the component at runtime, and then maybe fall back on this or something. So it is totally possible to do this and be flexible about what you're calling. That is a big aspect, which I don't want to get too stuck in like a pragmatic approach, but it's really nice to be able to reconfigure that kind of stuff at runtime. So that could be a pattern that you adopt with this too.
Sorry, real quick. I think eventually, right, I want to be able to start Wasm. I want to be able to start components on clients, right, like browsers, right? Eventually, someday.
Mhm.
So this kind of is going in that direction, right?
Yeah.
A little bit. I can see it.
Yeah.
I'm personally excited for WASI GFX That's what I'm waiting for.
Yeah, yeah, it's a super cool effort. Um, well, hey, we're running up to kind of the end. So I think it'd probably be good to go up to the other the other items. But Luke, I think this PR proposes a bunch of super interesting ideas. Really, my biggest thing, like the biggest concern that I want to make sure that we have addressed before we push it in is just like a way, like Colin said, that you can't like skirt around the access control model that we have now. Um, by just picking a target that exists in the lattice. But we absolutely need something like this for the more advanced Wasm Cloud use cases. You may not run into this for quite a long time, but you may want this for advanced use cases. And I think that this will be really informative as we think about the future of providers too, because they are kind of this bridge to outside of the lattice. Luke, is there anything else you wanted to say? Just wrap up the discussion. I hope that this, you're able to get some thoughts out and enough information. But what kind of follow up should we have from this, in your perspective?
Yeah. Thanks for letting me blabber on. I love it. I guess I'm going to be using this in my personal project, just to get it working, and I've got all my credentials locked down anyway. So I'll actually be using this in production. In terms of what's next, I think just for the next couple of days, maybe even a week, just hopefully everyone can get it internalized, kind of understand where does this take us? Does this replace existing functionality? Do we need to possibly take the philosophy of this and put it into maybe a wider provider SDK? And just like but really, I guess the best way to approach it would be to what ways can we maintain security without adding more burden onto the user? So
Yeah, 100%. Awesome. Yeah, that sounds great, Luke. And awesome to know that you're going to be trying this out too. We do have experimental feature flags now, so there is a notion that we could try and push something like this out as we're iterating on it. But yeah, awesome. Well, just to I know that we're at 2 o'clock, but we started at 1:05. So all of you people, you hang on. Don't go to your other meetings. You're not allowed. I did just want to discuss, if you have to drop, that's fine. I did want to discuss just two more quick things. One, on the Wasm Cloud organization, we have a Stalebot, which the intent is for it to kind of come along to pull requests that have been open for a long time, or issues that have been open. Thank you, Jochen. Issues that have been open for a long time. I'm not sure which one is a good example of this. I think maybe this one. We filed this issue over 90 days ago, so the GitHub action kind of comes around and says, hey, hasn't been any action. We're gonna close it in a week. And I think this is definitely at best gotten mixed reaction in the org. I think originally proposing it was to make sure that if something's been open for quite a long time and it's not getting fixed, maybe it's not so important. But I think it also has the other side um, of you know not making people feel very welcome to file issues, because their thing is getting closed for going stale when really it's not their fault. So just a heads up, open to any feedback there. But on the Wasm Cloud organization side, we are thinking about changing the way that this works. If anybody feels violently that we should keep the action, let me know. But I think we're definitely trending in the direction of not having it close issues automatically, because issues are important and we should be fixing them. So that was all. Just wanted to give an update to what we're thinking there. We'll open to any feedback there. Yeah. Taylor, did you on the last wasi-config thing, was this a quick one or something you wanted to have a little longer?
I wanted to get a little bit of feedback, and some of the people who I know would give feedback are still here, and some had to leave, so we can just kick it to next week.
Okay. All right.
Just put it at the front, or else. Anyway, we'll put it at the front and make sure it gets done.
Sounds good. Okay, that sounds good. Yeah, I think I talked for quite a long time in the beginning of the call, not remembering that we had two things. Hey Florian, welcome.
Demos are cooler anyway, so I just
yeah. Okay, well, I will share that PR, the wasi-config PR is still present in the in the community agenda, so everybody's welcome to take a look at that for some light pre-reading. But otherwise, I think we're out of time. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming to the community call this week and listening to some awesome discussion. Again, big thank you to Luke for your awesome PR and spurring some discussion there. It's really exciting stuff thinking about this in the Wasm Cloud's future context is really fun. So
Yeah, here for it. Thanks, man. Thanks, everyone.
all right, everybody. Well, I'll go ahead and stop the stream. Thanks everyone for coming, and we'll see you next week on Wednesday. We will not be at the conference yet, so we will be here. So have a great day. Have a Wasm Cloud day, and